In my previous video, I showed that Jesus did not teach that a divorced person has no right to a marriage, and that the exception clause has been totally misused. Apolluo is the Greek word that's translated put away, but put away is only one part of the divorce process according to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. Without the bill of divorcement, there is no divorce. Thus, when the Jewish men only put away their wives, put them out of the house, they were not divorcing them, which meant they were still married. And naturally, their wives would commit adultery and marrying another. If you doubt what I've told you about Jewish men putting away their wives, just do a web search for Jewish women in chains and read what you find. In the next few minutes, we're going to discuss the teachings of Paul, who answered questions that Christians had regarding marriage. It has been asserted by many that the Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, taught that persons divorced must remain celibate. The passage that is most commonly misunderstood and misused is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Look with me at the text from the King James Version, and then we'll look at the Weymouth Version. First of all, the King James, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 and 11. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. Now the reading from the Weymouth Version. Or if she has already left him, let her either remain as she is, or be reconciled to him, and that a husband is not to send away his wife. Naturally, those who are convinced that Jesus taught celibacy are going to try to explain Paul's teachings to harmonize with what they think Jesus taught. And the text that we just read is the most used Pauline text by those who contend that some have no right to a marriage. But in their efforts, they have to overlook or ignore some obvious problems. First, they have Paul contradicting himself. In the very same chapter, he said, verse 2, Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Then he said regarding the unmarried, noted in verse 8 and 9, let them marry. Clear command. In verse 27 and 28, he said, If you are bound to a wife, don't seek to be loosed. If you are loosed from a wife, don't seek a wife. Which was apparently advice because of the present distress mentioned in verse 26. And then he ended verse 28 by saying, But if you do marry, you have not sinned. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, he said. This is very clear language that is impossible to harmonize with the idea that Paul taught that the divorced commit adultery by marrying. But some try anyway, and one of the newest arguments is to make a play on the word bound. They contend that one who is divorced is still bound, unless the divorce was for adultery. Nevertheless, God authorized divorce, Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2, and it ends a marriage, which is what he designed it to do, as opposed to man putting us under his own way, by men just sending their wives out of the house. The idea that one can be divorced but still bound was evidently invented by J.T. Smith in 1984, who sought some semblance of harmony with the position he had been teaching on divorce and remarriage. But he is still a long way from truth that is harmonious. Another problem that those who insist that Paul teaches celibacy are met with is that the Apostle Paul did not give any indication in verse 10 and 11 or anywhere else that the cause of divorce was an issue. Therefore, he evidently did not have in mind a couple that had divorced. Rather, he dealt with the issue of one departing or just leaving, resulting in a separation. And the evident purpose of his words are that reconciliation, not remarriage, might take place. Not a few have misused the phrase, let her remain unmarried, to support the idea that Paul is talking about a couple that has divorced. Although the wording, as usually translated, seems to support that idea, it is contrary to the language that is used in the text there, and it's contrary to the context as well. In verse 10, we see the command to the wife that she not depart from her husband. But first of all, it is conjecture to conclude that depart here means divorce. Regarding the word translated depart, let us note a comment by a highly respected scholar. Strong, for the word korzo, he says to place room between, i.e. part. Reflexively, to go away, depart, put asunder, separate. Now let us note a comment from Robinson, which seems clear. He's saying Paul was talking about separation when he spoke of departing. Robinson's word pictures for the phrase, but and if she depart, he says, if in spite of Christ's clear prohibition, she gets separated. Bloomfield, another highly respected scholar, speaks about the language and the context regarding let her remain unmarried. Bloomfield, in his book, The Greek New Testament, he says from the use of, he gives the Greek word, and it's for reconcile, and the air of the context, it is plain that the apostle is not speaking of formal divorces affected by law, but separations, whether agreed on or not, arising from misunderstandings or otherwise. Thus we must keep in mind from the beginning that what is being contemplated is a case where a woman merely leaves or is separated from her husband. Now if one says the word unmarried in verse 11 means divorced, to be consistent he must apply that same meaning to the same word where it is found in verse 8 and 9, which would prove too much. Here the apostle says, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn, that is, burn in their lust one toward the other. Why would the Apostle Paul command to let the unmarried marry in one passage and then immediately turn around and say the opposite using the same word? Of course, he didn't. In verse 8 and 9, the teaching is that those who do not have a marriage are to be allowed to marry, whereas verse 10 and 11 teach that for the married it would be best to remain in that state, even if separated due to the present distress. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8 and 9, Paul is speaking regarding the unmarried. But at verse 10, he begins discussion that pertains to the married. Thus, when we look at the context of the passage that is used to teach celibacy, we see that it is not even about marriage. Rather, the inspired instruction is applicable to a couple that is separated. The apostle speaks of the possibility of one in a marriage becoming unhappy to the point that he departs. In such case, the couple is instructed to remain in that state while trying to work things out. The Weymouth New Testament and the Montgomery New Testament lends the most support to the probable intended meaning of the apostle as recorded in verse 11. Weymouth version reads, or if she has already left him, let her either remain as she is or be reconciled to him, and that a husband is not to send away his wife. Montgomery version reads, or if she has already left him, let her either remain as she is or be reconciled to him, and also that a husband is not to put away his wife. If the wife is departed or already left, that is, gone out of the home, back to parents or wherever, she is exhorted to remain as she is in the separated state or go back to her husband, not ex-husband, because divorce is not under consideration here. If a husband or wife actually ends the marriage by divorce, then this text no longer applies. Those who use 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 and 11 to teach that divorced persons have no right to marry are misconstruing Paul's teachings. The gist of Paul's teachings is that we must allow marriage for people who need it so that they can avoid fornication. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2. This would include people who, because of divorce, are loosed or no longer married. The primary teaching of the Apostle Paul is that those who are married should remain that way, and not only that, but also to be faithful to each other. If a couple should have problems and become separated, they should not make unwise and hasty decisions, especially during the time of distress, but be patient and endeavor to work things out.